Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready to dive into a really interesting book.
Absolutely.
Today we're going to be talking about Morgan Housel's The Psychology of Money. But this is not your typical finance book.
No, not at all. This one really digs into the psychology and the behavioral side of money.
Yeah, and that's what makes it so fascinating. It's like he's saying, look, it's not always about the numbers. It's about understanding the why behind our financial decisions.
Exactly. Because we can have all the financial knowledge in the world, but if we don't understand our own psychology around money, we're kind of flying blind.
Totally.
Yeah.
And one of the first things Housel talks about is how our personal histories really shape our beliefs about money. Like
Yeah.
we each have this kind of invisible money script that's been written over the years.
Yeah, it's like those gas lines back in the 70s. People who lived through that whole experience might be really, really cautious about inflation. Even today, that experience is like seared into their memory.
Wow. Yeah, that's such a good illustration.
Yeah.
And it makes you think about all those other seemingly small events in our past that have probably shaped our views on money, even if we don't even realize it.
Oh, absolutely. And it's not just big economic events either. Think about family dynamics too.
Yeah.
Like someone who grew up with a parent who was constantly stressed about money, they might end up being overly cautious even if they're actually doing well financially as adults.
Like these invisible forces are at play, shaping our behaviors without us even knowing it.
Exactly.
This is already making me rethink some of my own, like, money habits, to be honest.
Yeah.
But, one thing that really jumped out at me was Housel's point about how success and failure aren't always as straightforward as they seem.
Yeah, he really digs into that. He
Yeah.
talks about the role of luck and risk, and how those things play a bigger role than we often acknowledge. And one example he gives, which is just fascinating and kind of sad, is he talks about Bill Gates, right?
Yeah.
Bill Gates, the founder of Microsoft, brilliant guy. But he had this friend, right, equally brilliant guy named Kent Evans. And tragically, Evans died at a young age in a climbing accident. And Housel uses this example to illustrate how even when you have two people with incredible talent and drive, luck can just play such a huge role in how things turn out.
Right. And it really makes you realize that sometimes it's not about being the smartest person in the room. It's about being in the right place at the right time. And that's a bit, I don't know, it's a bit humbling in a way, isn't it?
Absolutely. It really is. And on the flip side, it also means we shouldn't be so hard on ourselves when things don't go our way financially.
Right.
It's not always a sign of bad decisions. Sometimes it's just it's the hand you're dealt.
Yeah. It's about being kinder to ourselves, I think, acknowledging
Yeah.
those factors outside our control. But speaking of things we can control, Housel dives deep into this concept of compounding, which is, that whole idea time is money.
And he doesn't just tell you it's important. He really drives the point home with some pretty powerful examples. Like, remember the one about Warren Buffett? He says, imagine if Buffett had started investing in his 30s instead of when he was a kid.
Oh, right.
And he runs the numbers, and it's astounding. Buffett's net worth would be a fraction of what it is today if he had started later. Those extra years of compounding, they made all the difference.
It's amazing to think about, It's like, even if you're not starting with a ton of money, if you're consistent and you give it time, that's where the magic really happens.
It's the snowball effect. It starts small, but then it just keeps building and building.
Exactly. And it's something that, we hear about a lot, but when you actually see the numbers, it really hits home.
For sure.
But this kind of leads to another big question, right? When do you have enough?
May.
Because if we're always chasing that next financial milestone, will we ever actually feel content?
Right. And that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And honestly, it's something I think a lot of us struggle with. It's so easy to fall into that trap of moving the goalpost. Oh, tell me about it. I'm like the queen of moving the goalpost.
Right. You hit one financial target and then bam, you're already thinking about the next bigger, shinier thing.
It's never enough.
Right. But that's the thing. It's often fueled by comparison.
Totally.
And Housel uses this great analogy. He talks about like a rookie baseball player, right?
Yeah.
And this player is making like $500,000 a year.
Which, okay, that's bad.
Right. Sounds pretty amazing.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. This rookie is playing alongside a superstar, right? And that superstar is making like $36 million a year.
Oh, no. Comparison.
Exactly. And suddenly, that $500,000 doesn't seem quite so huge anymore.
Wow.
And that's the sneaky thing about relative deprivation, right?
Ah.
Our happiness with our own financial situation, it's not just about the actual numbers. It's about how those numbers compare to those around us.
So true, so true. And, it's funny. We always hear don't compare yourself to others, but it's so much easier said than done, right?
Yeah.
Especially in this day and age with social media and everything. Oh, absolutely. It's like it's everywhere you look, right? But okay, so if constantly chasing after more isn't the answer, what does Housel suggest we do instead?
Right, right.
Well, he's got this really interesting idea, and it might sound kind of counterintuitive at first. He says we should think of saving money as like finding this amazing investment, one that always works.
Okay, I'm listening. Tell me more about this always works investment.
Yeah.
How does saving fit into that?
So it's all about shifting our perspective on saving, right? It's not just about, hoarding cash under the mattress or whatever. It's about the feeling of control and security that comes with knowing you have resources. Savings give you options, and options equal freedom, right? And that's powerful.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. When you put it that way, it's not just about the money itself, it's about what that money represents.
Exactly. It's like, remember back in the 70s with that whole oil crisis? You know what really helped America get through that? It wasn't finding like a magic oil well overnight or anything. It was adapting, It was learning to use less.
Oh, right. They had become more efficient, less reliant.
Exactly. And that's kind of what saving does for us, too. It gives us that wiggle room, that flexibility to navigate challenges and come out stronger.
Okay, that's a really good analogy. I get it. So we've talked about our money history. We've talked about the role of luck. We've talked about compounding, the importance of saving. What else does Housel dive into?
Well, he also challenges us to think a bit differently about how we actually make financial decisions.
Okay.
And one of the things he says is that sometimes it's actually better to aim for reasonable over rational.
Reasonable, not rational.
Hmm.
That's intriguing. Tell me more about that distinction. At first glance, it seems a little counterintuitive.
Right. You'd think rational would be the goal, but think about it. We're humans, right? We're not robots. We've got these emotions, and those emotions, whether we like it or not, they play a huge role in how we deal with money.
Absolutely. Our feelings about money are so deeply rooted.
Exactly. It's not about like throwing logic out the window. It's about recognizing that sometimes the most rational choice on paper might not actually be the best choice for our own peace of mind.
Oh, that makes sense. So it's about finding that balance.
Exactly.
Being informed and logical, but also, like you said, factoring in the emotional side of the equation.
Yes. And it's like he gives this example. Why do people still take Tylenol for a fever, even when studies show that in many cases it might not actually be necessary,
Right.
It's about comfort. It's about reducing anxiety. And sometimes that's its own reward.
That's such a good point. I'd never thought about it like that, but it's so true. Sometimes peace of mind, that feeling of control, it's worth more than being perfectly rational.
Exactly. It's about what helps us sleep better at night.
Totally. Okay, reasonable over rational.
Yeah.
What other, key insights does Housel offer up?
Well, he brings up this other concept that I think a lot of people tend to overlook, and it's the idea of room for error.
Room for error. Okay. I like the sound of that already, especially when it comes to finances.
Right. And he uses this really cool analogy. He compares financial planning to the strategies that professional blackjack card counters use.
Oh, wow. Blackjack card counters. This just got interesting. Okay, break it down for me. How do card counters factor in room for error?
So these card counters, right, they have these systems, these strategies that give them an edge, right?
Right.
But here's the thing. Even the most skilled card counters, they build room for error into their bets. They know a hot streak won't last forever.
Right. Got to account for the inevitable cold streak.
Exactly. And that's what we need to do with our finances, too. We need to expect the unexpected, right? Life happens, markets go up and down, and we got to be prepared for that.
So, having that emergency fund, not going crazy with debt, being realistic about investment returns, it's all part of creating that cushion.
Absolutely. It's about building in that resilience.
Right.
And it reminds me of this example that Housel uses. He talks about these German tanks, the super advanced tanks they had during World War II.
Okay, yeah. Weren't those supposed to be, top of the line?
Oh, yeah, state of the art. But what took a bunch of them out?
What? Not enemy fire?
Nope. Field mice.
No way. Seriously, mice took down these high-tech tanks.
Yeah. Can you imagine? All that engineering, all that firepower, and they were defeated by something so small and unexpected.
Wow. Okay. That's a powerful image.
Right. It just goes to show, even the best laid plans.
Need a little wiggle room.
Exactly. It's like you don't want to abandon ship just because things get a little choppy, but you also don't want to go down with the ship if you're headed straight for an iceberg.
Right.
You got to be willing to adjust your course.
Okay, I like that. So be prepared, be flexible. What else you got?
Well, that actually ties into another really important point that Housel makes. He says it's crucial to define the game you're playing financially. Because a lot of times investors get into trouble by trying to play someone else's game.
What do you mean? Can you give me an example of that?
Yeah, so think about the dot-com bubble back in the late 90s, right? You had all these investors who were all about those quick profits, right? They were in it for the short game, riding that wave of momentum.
Boy. Yeah.
And, there's nothing inherently wrong with that as long as that's your strategy, your risk tolerance. But the problem is when you have people with long-term goals, like retirement or whatever, and they get caught up in that short-term frenzy, they start playing a game they don't really understand.
They're like using baseball rules in a basketball game, right?
Yeah.
It's not going to end well.
Exactly. And it happens all the time. People see others making money and they want to get in on the action without really thinking about whether it aligns with their own goals and their own risk tolerance.
So true. So know yourself, know your goals, and know the game you're playing.
Exactly. And speaking of knowing yourself, Housel has some really interesting thoughts about optimism and pessimism, especially when it comes to financial forecasting.
Oh, yeah. He kind of turns that whole idea of pessimism equals intelligence on its head a little bit, doesn't he?
He does. He argues that pessimism often gets more attention because, we have this negativity bias. We're hardwired to pay more attention to threats and dangers. So a headline about the market crashing is always going to grab more eyeballs than a headline about slow and steady growth, even if the slow and steady growth is more likely.
It's like that Russian professor he mentions in the book, the one who predicted the collapse of the United States.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
His prediction made headlines everywhere, even though if you actually dug into it, it was based on some pretty shaky assumptions.
And it happens all the time. Remember all the talk about peak oil back in the early 2000s?
Oh, yeah.
Everyone was convinced we were running out of oil, that prices were going to skyrocket. And yeah, the price of oil did go up for a while. But what a lot of those predictions missed was the power of human ingenuity and adaptation.
Right, like all those new technologies that came about.
Exactly. Fracking and horizontal drilling and all that. It completely changed the game. And suddenly, we weren't running out of oil anymore.
So it's a good reminder to be aware of risks, for sure, but not to let pessimism cloud our judgment or prevent us from looking for solutions.
Absolutely. Sometimes the best opportunities come from challenging those doom and gloom predictions and looking for creative ways forward.
Okay, love that. So we've covered a lot of ground here. Our money history, the role of luck, compounding, saving, making decisions, dealing with risk. Anything else we should touch on before we wrap things up?
One thing that I really appreciate about Housel's book is emphasis on the idea that true wealth is often about what you don't see.
Oh, that's interesting. What does he mean by that? I thought wealth was about, having a lot of money.
Well, yeah, that's part of it. But he makes a distinction between being rich and being wealthy.
Right.
Being rich, that's about the stuff, right? The fancy cars, the big house, the lavish vacation. It was all very visible. Yeah. But being wealthy, that's about having options, about having financial security and freedom. It's about having those assets that haven't been converted into those material possessions. Yeah.
Okay, I see. So it's less about showing off what you have and more about having the peace of mind and the flexibility to live the life you want to live.
Exactly. It's about owning your time, having the freedom to walk away from a job you hate or pursue a passion project, things that money can't buy directly but can certainly enable.
It's about having those choices.
Yes. And that, I think, is the true reward of really mastering the psychology of money. It's not just about accumulating more zeros in your bank account. It's about aligning your financial decisions with your values, with your vision for a good life.
So well said. It's about taking control of your financial journey and designing a future that actually reflects what matters most to you. Wow, this has been such an insightful conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time to dive into the psychology of money with me today.
My pleasure. It's always fun to talk about this stuff.
Me too. It's really got me thinking about my own money script and how I can make it work better for me. To all our listeners out there, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.